Serve. Dama döngürü
Good morning. Good morning, Gen Rinpoche, Tashi Delay. And good morning, Katrina. Thank you for translating for us today, and welcome to everyone online. Just one important announcement before we begin our prayers, and that is that Geshe will be traveling in India in the next month, and so we will pause our teachings. Today will be the last teaching until the end of September, so please keep an eye on the website for when we resume the teachings. Okay, we'll begin with some preliminary prayers, and the link for that is in the chat box. To the teacher endowed, transcend and destroy, the one thus gone, the foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, nor the world's supreme guide of beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans, to you the Buddha endowed, transcend and destroy, the glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, make offerings and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you are born on this earth, you pay 7 strides and said, I'm supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With your body's form supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme sign, space like a spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms, unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings, the holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop, a dew, a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niyatayami. I take refuge until I am awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
자, 닉송겐.
야, 야, 당연 좋다. 야, 다 가수래. 계속 전부 쉬어가려 송래로. 된줄되네 니버신도 가. 기비 된줍도 봐 줘봐라. 걔든 데라 펜바 마주나 친디 안다 줘봐 갈랑 줘르시. 세송 받아. 라조 탄다 톱데베 밀리디라. 아니 슈주발라. 델시. 콤바. 냐와이 된주라부터 이렇게 해나. 뭐야? Chutubetini, Kuga Mangan, and the Kivana, Chutubala Metalora, Della Gas, Chutubala Della. George was a tingy sometimes in Jordana, Danjon Denise, never Shinduka, Tatunda, Chutubala, tingy sometimes, Roa, Gagin of churches, Siena Mabunga, Mahinde. Chu matters and now bet you Sanji Chumde, Chu matters long but of Tindele Makivacha. Or Tindico, Chutubala Telvare, Combarva, Seneche, or Tingi someone's oteres, Tension Dini. Never Shinduka, the Shindu Tarang at the top of the melody. Pe Shindu Nebaka, Cheres, Sachin Bucheres, Ungiona. Caresana, Nekawa Indi, they go to get the Shindu Nakawa somewhere. Cultivation to Cabo Condition, Chida me lu Toba Samria, shall make you a chew chop on Balasoba, Sutim, make it chew Sutim number Tabas Songoyada, Sutim Songoyada. Teni Melu Cabarishan Tobalia, Tate and Doanichi, Shanda, Sanjay Tambatan, Malam Kyon Lamata Malam Yuba, Tindeta, Tiko Yoda, Tunda, Melu Tobalia, Sutim. Number was so yet. Make it chupan, Kewachu to education to Kawura. Combore. Tenica Sore. Taking the Chimbata Sutim data, so the Melikeva Yanaya. Yana Chimba Madana. Longu Ulbut in the Chana Kaleora. Don't go Chimbaton Kore, Chimbe Longu Chimbucho at Totalia. Longu Chimbo Mel Longu Kangi Unit Church that some down to your mother. Or did Longu Chimbo Yopera. Longu de Peshu Tansadi, Milu Cabaret she talk with the mother. Don't do everything to it, and it which Chimbo of so the pencil Chimbo the shot now could Peshu over down to Mardo. Tension Denny. Never Shinduka said. Nika Tatunda. Chitim Songata, Chimbata, Serba, La Sobata, and then Molam Yakura, Chimba, Chute, Serba, someday, Shirabla Soba Kanga, Chikin Sanguora, Tandangara, Milidia, Joanga Matindil Combache, to the Sadi order. The Indico, Tende, the Judician to go in Bena, Tension in Neba Shinduka, Starry Lenges and Nebares, the Tanda Yobacha with Songutua, Tichilan.
So, to begin with, as the Master Shantideva says, this life of leisures and endowments is extremely difficult to find, and this is something by which we can accomplish the aims of beings. However, if we fail to do that now, then how could we possibly gain such a life again in the future? So right now we have this kind of life with all of the sort of freedoms or leisures to be able to practice the Dharma. If we were, say, born in a hell realm, or if we were born in a kind of country wherein the Dharma had not spread, we wouldn't have this sort of opportunity. All of the kinds of conducive conditions that are necessary for doing the Dharma. But to get all of this kind of life, one where we have encountered the teachings, one where we have all of these kinds of conditions, we should recognize this as something that is quite rare. We should see this as valuable, as precious. When we look at how difficult it is to find, we can think about it being difficult in terms of the causes that are necessary. Just to gain a human rebirth, not even a sort of particularly special human rebirth, we need to guard ethical conduct. We need to abandon the 10 non-virtues. And that in and of itself is quite rare, to have that kind of ethical conduct that will lead to a good rebirth. And in addition to that, we need to make the kind of efforts at other activities that will provide the sort of conducive conditions, making prayers that all of this come together. So if we want to have this kind of particularly special sort of human life, we have to engage in the proper sort of things, like ethical conduct as a basis, but also generosity and patience and joyous effort and so forth. And if we have not done those actions, there's no way that we're going to gain this kind of a rebirth. So we want to ensure that we have a good life as a human, but additionally, we need to have things like enough possessions to be able to sustain ourselves. If we are in abject poverty, it becomes quite difficult to do any kind of Dharma practice. And so too, if we don't have a human rebirth, but experience the results of generosity ripening, we don't really know how to use those possessions, those objects in a beneficial way. So we need to ensure that we don't get a bad rebirth with the sort of good conditions ripening on that. So here it is the case that these causes are extremely rare, and we need to make the kind of effort at developing those causes, as well as making prayers that all of those come together such that we have this kind of fortunate rebirth again in the future.
Oh yeah. Oh, that ko ka so da. Ngara de tanda to de milite to ya liya hani. Kumambo to kawasan da ti to kabore so da. Chimba tsutim de ko re do. Saba kom go de. Saba ma kom na. Chimba tsutim to to. Ya bo yon to ya yo ma re. Saba ma kom na. Ani kesa ma bo chom ya da. Rang yi mizu ke tana thong me do ba. Ro ye to me ho tin de thong de re yo da. Jinda tsude saba. Jundu zamgora di dundala ki jundu gewala toshindu zamba kware. Samdense teju tole samlutane semtot shine chenyi samkwa ma gena gena. Jidon dunda samlutan di dundu sem jogora teta di songi teta di bangi samsa. Ni shirabse gyawa nga ma shirabla to changba cheyore. Di sonza tanda nga zo dingi je gomna gom tongge shirabji cheba chena che tongge chi kegawara. O di kiyade jimba tsurin soba samdenla soba kyo nga ma kombo mambu cheni yongi wala. O di sonza chindu ne nipa kawa re se. Di tsutim suya di miki chubongi tsutim re. Di toli ya shenla chawa bombe tsutim se wala. Di toli ya ne genyi na kisu na ane gyalong pamata sanga ki kambala soba di yone dele kya. O puson soba rito. O tindi sunga le cheni yongi wala. Tianchun deni nipa shindu kwa. Tā dī tōli yā kārī chē tōku rē sī na kīpī tōntūp tōpa kyūpa lā sī. Kiawā chīma pēnchē kī sōsū tōntā tō tūp tōku rē sī kua rē. Kiawā chīma pēnchē sōsū tōntā kārī tūpē wā rē, ngā tō lā tā mī ngā sōng lā mā kī lā mī kō mā chī tūpē wā rē, kīpū chōngu kī. Kīpū tīngdā chī na ngā sōng kī tōngi lē thār wā sā mā yīmbā, kōyē tōngi lē lā tā mī lē sōpa lē tā ngā mō bā shiāngā chī kī kiawā tī lē thār wā chē kī, kōyē tōngi lē thār wā chē wā rē. O tile lakba chewe ne, rāngā chibu tabo sa māyīmba, pāmar jiwe simchen tamche cha, rāngla chīnshimbu yīmbe, chīnshien ki simchen ti sāma tamche le, pēn tō tumge, tūnge dāng, nye sōng dāng, kōyē tūnge le chawā chī tumge, tā tamche kimbe sālam gui tumge ki, nūpa yōnsu sōnge ki, tabda shirwa niga tar shimbe, sānge di kubān tōpar chā samsa, o tinde tin tanda, tūki warwa, ti tūpa tūku re sōngara. Ya.
Mm.
Modi.
So, here, the kind of life that we have right now, we must have accumulated in the past the sort of causes to have such a life. We must have engaged in ethics and generosity and patience and so forth. And so, too, looking forward, it's important that we also continue to engage in these practices, holding to a kind of ethical conduct, engaging in generosity. And patience is particularly important because if we lack patience, then when we get angry, we destroy the roots of our virtue. When we have this kind of attitude that sees others as unpleasant and we engage with them in that way, we are likely to destroy any sort of positive, virtuous activity that we have done. And so we should have the kind of resolve thinking, I will guard ethical conduct. I will make sure that I engage in generosity and patience. And even if we have not, like in this life, we have from our previous efforts gained the sort of conditions wherein we are able to develop our meditative concentration, whether we have actual concentration or not, to be able to focus and enough understand this is what I should be adopting, this is what I should be abandoning, and so forth. And we have the kind of intelligence to be able to discriminate between those because we have practiced wisdom in the past. So here, at the very least, we want to ensure that we gain such a good rebirth again in the future, whether that is just holding the kind of ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtues, abandoning any sort of harmful action toward others, or even maybe we have the opportunity to take vows of individual liberation or bodhisattva tantric vows. So we have this opportunity in this life right now to use that, as it says in the second line, for the benefit of beings, for the welfare of beings in this world. And at the very least, we want to ensure that we gain another good rebirth so we can continue to practice the Dharma. So the first level of the being of small scope is to think, with this kind of life, I'm going to ensure that I don't fall into the lower realms. But seeing that even if we are to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god, that's really not free from this suffering nature of samsara. So going beyond that, we think, I want to be freed from all of samsara. May I strive to get liberated from this cycle of existence. And even beyond that, we can see that, well, it's not just us who is in this kind of situation, but all of these other sentient beings who have acted toward us with such great kindness. We think, I want to be able to bring them to this state of Buddhahood. May I myself attain the state of perfect, complete enlightenment, perfect in knowledge and ability, and so forth, in order that I am able to bring other sentient beings to that state. So this is the kind of attitude that we should set, thinking that with this life, we are going to use this for the welfare of beings.
Oh yeah. 다 getting dele pemba ma tu na se ta tanda kugab sambo tinde yebe ten dele ya so so chane je tuye yo ro tup tuye yo ra de ma du be che ten de ta wa se chen de chi bu sam lo ko dele chen dele ten tu ten gen so de sam lo ko a de jang jang tun da ma do chen da ke me sam sa sam lo ko chi de be na a ni chi ma pan je tun da tu tu wa tu tu ma ro getting dele pemba ma tu na de ta be kugab sambo chon ne tanda dele yin de chen de chi bu tun da yin de 시주 맹게더와 모두 딱바리스도 땡갱이 삼마다 치매 펜제가 삼로 매바이나 아니 만들어서 보라 걔든들라 치매 펜제래 신디 지부 통도라 저와 치매때 장정 부인 정부 때도 그 계절와 지인도 되게 전부에서 그거라 걔든들라 펜바마도나 친디 안다 좀 갈아줘 다 치수 마음바나야 디데테 토야테 걸레 가보레스 데 가르스는 가는 좀 남주네 미케 초라야 샹라 초라서 미케 초라 공부시에 초라 계획 초라 공부시에 초라데 대소자 망샤 내성도 롱땡게리 시레마도 데데 고급 상부용에 가보레 성교하라 오야 티치라
So, if we don't use the kind of opportunity that we have right now, and often we come under the control of thinking like, well, this life will remain, it's going to be stable and here for a long time. We fall into this kind of grasping at permanence and get caught up in just the affairs of this life. But now, while we have this opportunity, as this verse says, if we don't use this, if we don't take advantage of it, then who knows what will happen in the future? This life is very short. short, but the kind of suffering and happiness of the future are quite long. So at the very least, we should be thinking about our future lives. And while we have this kind of state that is so difficult to attain, we should make an effort to put it towards something positive. We are, for the most part, more habituated to negative actions and thereby engage in non-virtue. But we should, having a kind of awareness of this, say, no, I'm going to use this very life in order to do something positive.
뭐야, 뒤인도 다 돈다 가서다. 말아주 돈다 빌리 토반데 빼 돈다 전부인 거지. 수수 삼로 거고도 자 전부 시부시 마음 봐 돈다 전부 두개 이거지. 된대 두개 돈다리야. 기부 총으로 지내 샤라 좋아 봐야. 기부 땡으로 지내 나오 냠바다 차차바다 당와 봐야. 냠모 봐야로. 기부 전부 얘나 아니 지금 셴배 딱배 셴지 봐. zembalasa wa tezo le changje tezo tanda nyeri mesena le samlo tangu yara pena megi chunde china tongara zo chisi choy ba do bangi se kela na ya to sta yi chirba ina nyeri samlo tang thone ya wa nyeri samlo ma ta na pena so ma che na ya so ma che thamma ma che megi chu ma che na ya ko chebe tikba yo ra ma to chi pangbe kyo ke yo ma ra ta je kinder지나 가지 미세 말아 그 미세 방배 겨우게 좀 말아 되고요 말아 되고요 말아 다음에 생각하죠 다 스테이션 마세비나 되고요 말아 마도 겨우게요 말아 방기에 삼자 들은 메시지 날이야 미겨 주대 방향을 저와 지금 매서 신이그 템퍼처비 섬 아니 지금 오늘 식사 단계리네 건다 삼을단데 들은야 샤레 저와체마 템버치는 야부들인데 제베에서 스스로 가고 로 근데 지나시 공동하게 차도라서 뭐 거에 녀모 들이들이들 정말서 뒷방토서 야부청성 삼사 개충마서 근데 삼단이 예린예린나 삼단 팽이도 용거라 소시 방바 정 방바 참마 방배 팽이 용거라 때문에 다 계시셔 마준 도 스테이션에 팽이가 말아 제 손상가라서 동발랑바이네 말랑바이네 예린예린 메시나리아고 기능 뚫레 티치에서 틴데틴데체 주샤당고도 땡에마디 까담벨라마도 티데소도 니마레르나 가르가르 총소서 니마 타부로 틴데네 솔라가리 무티고래 기름멘디 바차와 제바다 가르가르 장가데 담보도 바타부 코라 나보스네 르미 강게와래 예린예린 삼도다 뇨르chen 파루칠레 나보 트예체 메바차비와라 응아라도 다 사자는도 대셔되네 가리나 랑자 대르마도 건과드레게 말아 요한드에 삼르데 타바리스탄데 건 조함멘도 시기요 말아 무슨 셈지 연된데 고 공발레 때네 고네 건드레와 어디질라나 야
So, right now, we have this kind of life, and we should recognize that it is really very precious, and thereby we should use this for something meaningful. We should really recognize the value of it, and thereby not let it go to waste. At the level of the being of small scope, this is gaining a good rebirth as a human or a god in the future, abandoning the 10 non-virtues and engaging in beneficial activities for that purpose. And then the middling level thinks of all of samsara as being in the nature of suffering, and thereby applies to the antidotes, thinking about getting rid of this grasping at a self and all of the other afflictions that cause us to cycle within samsara. And going even beyond that is thinking about how can I benefit others, these beings that have been so kind to me? May I be able to become a Buddha in order to benefit them? And so whatever sort of level we are at, it's really important that we call to mind, that we set an intention about these sorts of things. Just not engaging in non-virtuous actions doesn't mean that we are accumulating virtue. So for example, like a dog or something isn't going around killing beings, but they aren't getting the kind of virtue of not killing because there's no intention there. If we don't think about this, if we don't set our intention, and in some ways we might like set an intention thinking like, oh, I'm never going to engage in any non-virtuous actions until I'm enlightened. But really, we need to refresh this. We need to think about it on a daily basis in order to really develop our mind. Our mind develops through habits, through becoming accustomed to things. And so here we need to be able to see what we did with our mind, thinking, reflecting on the day, thinking, oh, I did this good thing. I did a positive, virtuous activity and rejoice in that. Or we think, oh, I was able to abandon this. You see the benefits of abandoning that particular action and make a deliberate effort to do so. Then this is something that whether or not we have taken vows, even if we are just talking about like the 10 non-virtues, to at the beginning of each day, think about those, set our intention with regard to those is what is going to bring about the kind of benefit. As the Kadampa masters of the past talked about, we set that sort of intention, and then at the end of the day, we should reflect, what did I do? What sort of good things and bad things did I do? Like if at that time they might have been living in a cave and taking a piece of coal or something to make black marks for every negative action. And at the beginning of this exercise, the whole walls were like filled with black marks, but over time they're able to reduce that. This is how we work with our mind, but we have to think about it. We have to make that kind of intention and not just sort of like, oh, long term, but really refresh it on a daily basis and evaluate, see if we are making a difference in our mind.
Oh yeah, the indica soda. Arantu Yana and the Kumdichi, Chikum Chambada, and Yuji Chanjusin, Ra, Karikomba Yinaya. Oh, the again do they order. The same bit in the Pausha Shavi or never church to Dora. Namsada Chikomba Champachi, Nijiki, Namsan get to Mara. Toma Mevan and the Medicho de Comde Ora. Tina, Kaze Comna Keke, Medu Samsa, Mayana and some Diana and some time to combat on Rode. Oh, the Duca soda. The Yaki Medu Samsa Teo Marto. Jisam Ji Paucha Shavi. Tesumji Cheba in a chair put in the Tesum Cheba and Tarves Sabe shitting by Songudua. Tarves Pachaco shit of things at Chubad Mosi at Javiora. Kisoda Kochi Yajan Ross Documento Samsa Kaje from the Titan Giomara, Kaje Samlatana Tesambi, Nuvasim between the Pachasha were Tesonda on the Pegiora. Oh, yeah, what to do sometimes in Bache. Tatunda, oh, Mambushan and Angorode. Oh, this is Gasoda. Can you merely talk about the Tanda de Bachichegusam? Tende Cheva in a social medicine dinner, Tawadi Ungora. The Injimage Samtangura. Church, yes, the Chima to Bajimado, Tendel Pendo Mangas and the young Sam Tangi Omara. Church, yes, the Kaja Chendi Chibut and the Church goes to the Shado, Timadira. Oh, Tindo Carsoda. Chendelico Younger. Pendi Junior Sanjay Tembasido. Tempers to Pugla, you are Chimasiora. There was said the Chendilisiora. Chendilla in the country Chorching, I guess, or Trado, Chorching, let's watch you, Mason, Tama Chizu, I didn't get in Mason at the Samartana. And it was Soso Pandeora, Soso Sempakiva, Namina Sempakiva, Tambu Namine Congress, Chambatsa or Congress Poete, Soso Tessetines, any catcher church, Chipa, teacher, we are talking. Or Tisonza Carsoda. Oh, Tinder Samartan, Tanda. Can you Melitoba the Tanda de Bache and to show Yang Golishan, the Chisha Chuba, Kululan, Lulango Carasta, Tanga, show Tangdolishan, Belenji, Lutrin Malana Kadulang Sanashi. Can you million did that we always told the Sosa Kuga chair, the chair, you were the Tawastanda Mevatan, member Lutrin Malakadula, Tirim Majak Kaduche Seriscuda. Oh, Tinder Samartane. Any car soda. Oh, Kawachima Ladami, combating the Bartovacha. There's a Maimba, Nyomo, Tendo Pambeleta, Nyomo, Shawan between the Rameba, Kichichego, Tele Tawachi. There's a Maimba, Tala Kadinchi, Simple Tamje, Decadinchi, Decadin Bechese, Yomar, Kawa Tameba Sonda, Tamje Kadinchi in BS, Teda Tamje, Tabata Tamje Kimball and go Tungank in Nuba Yanganki, Sambucha. Tarchimba, champagne samla, tabbe shencheba so. Any shame which are landor genetum, the Tarchimba Sanji, you go on to Tobarcha, Techedo, and the Tekula Labechedo, Toba, the Sambo Combachiganism, 대단할 수있는 게 some kulung set and the semper shows, yeah,
So, whatever it may be that we are applying our mind to, like love and compassion and so forth, whenever we engage in these things, whenever we think about them, we are putting down imprints in our minds. We are creating habits, but we can't expect this to be something that brings about an immediate change. It's not like just flipping a switch, but rather we should have the understanding that it is with every reflection, with every time we put our minds to that, we are creating the kind of imprints that will eventually make that sort of change. We shouldn't have this thought of like, oh, I can't improve, I can't develop this kind of attitude. We can't also expect that just reflecting upon love and compassion a few times is going to bring about a radical change. But however much we think about these topics, however much we develop that, we are like putting down that kind of foundation. However much we reflect upon love and compassion or impermanence or whatever it might be, we are creating those kinds of imprints that really will have an impact on our mind. And so we shouldn't have this idea that our practice of the Dharma is just for this life, but we also shouldn't have the idea that it's only going to bring us benefits in future lives, but rather the Dharma is referred to as the source of benefit and happiness. Benefit referring to the kind of long-term benefits that come from the Dharma in our future lives beyond just this life alone. Because really, for it to be Dharma practice, we can't just be thinking about this life alone. But we also have, through our practice of the Dharma, we bring about happiness, as in we bring about a kind of mental peace that comes in this life right now by reducing our kinds of afflictions. If we have less pride and less anger and less jealousy and so forth, we are happier, we experience the kind of happiness in this life. And when we reflect upon love and compassion and so forth, we begin with our family, with those that are right around us. And by creating that kind of harmony and good relations with those around us, it's not just some future result that is beneficial, but rather it's right now that we experience a kind of benefit from this. So again, we should recognize how precious the opportunity is that we have right now in this life, in this body that we have taken up at this moment. As it is explained with the example of someone who is sort of crippled, or they didn't have any legs, and there was a wild ass running by, and they fling themselves onto this wild ass and are singing a song, and people are going, well, why are you singing? And he's like, well, when else am I going to have this kind of opportunity? Look what I have right in this moment. And so that's the kind of attitude that we should have, really reflecting upon the life that we have with a sense of it being so incredibly precious. And with that, we then want to use this in order to benefit ourselves in the future, and not just ourselves. I mean, we begin with the kind of thought that, well, I definitely need to gain a good rebirth as a human or a god, but not just that. I want to get out of samsara entirely, this cycle of suffering, and thereby I'm going to make efforts at getting rid of the afflictions. But it's not just me who is in this situation, but these greatly kind sentient beings, and not just one or two have been kind to me, but given that there are countless previous lives, there's really not a single being I can point to who hasn't been kind to me, who hasn't shown me great kindness. So thereby, I'm aspiring to become the kind of being who is able to bring about the highest happiness for all of these sentient beings, a fully enlightened Buddha who has removed all faults and developed all good qualities. And so it is in that way that we really take advantage of this moment that we have right now and recognize that every sort of habit we are creating is something important.
Oh, yeah. 당한 저 데레 소 그서 어디 조사서 다들 쇼로가도 실락상 되고 다네 녀와 렘벌 싸워시러
No.
공부 루트고 송고도 와 다단다 다음에 버셔요라 가래서도 셴라 차와다 녀모다 강가 용사게 시대 간에 용기도 선행아 삼남중아즈 삼르치도 와 나나 삼두장아 라와로치 예배 삼르 코고도 와오 텐데 남중아즈 삼르 코로나 신경아티 요 말다 스티셰기와래 아 삼가마체 내가이 삼사네 가조세 네 건조세 다 강가 용기와라 dinde namju samde na shin nga de yo ma re so ra nga ju samdu kar samda sobo ke tedo yo ma re sowa dewa dunge de tedo ke yo ma re nga sam koran loga chi samlu tang do dinde nga chi yo ma re wa koran rang ne shanda da nyam do dom ne ni le pa ta shan ke chi nam sha chi sha wo ma to chi dinde chi yo ma ra di me ba de samlu tang go re so go ra ta yin ya de ya di me ba se de khasin lai ba nang ba ta ke le ma re se de san de ji shen ge ga ba de khashi ya bu she do khashi go ma ju she do nang ba le ta yo ma re ta me ne kyo kan de siling ge re ya kyo nga chi yo re si yo re se ra san ge chum de ta yo ma yo ke ju she yo ma re se ra ya de na she kar so da ji de je ba bo yo ma yo le ya de ne ke ju so yo ma re se ra de de she do no to khashi khashi le ya 다요 마요 렘바게 소소 요르바 급다 툴레 카사디 삼바다 강가 켄데 예스네 마디 메스네 마디 요네 네고 카가 슈샤니 아요라 켄데 요라 마도 지다코 다메스 세브체 소고라 다메스데 랑웨 답지 랑와첸데 랑웨네 투베타메 테네 딱바선비 다요스 티투 냥그레세 잠바니지 공고레세 타보 둥엘레 타고레스 거라 다요레 Chiriba Deva Nashi Tata, Rangwe to Tuangan, Namju Los Hekina Samba Nashi, Gatin de Omare Sungivara. O Tinashi, Chikten Chibabo, Omare Sungivara. Then the Yana Chuni Kone Ko Kuzukuna She, Chibabu Me Shegivara. Salujabe Dokapso. O Tome Mariba Kunela, Yum Kanga Jungsa Shidiri Dasi. Sani Kele, Sani Yagasukanga, Mikele to a Kanga Yungare Sungde. Chibabo yo mara so chibabo shanda chune te she ko yo mara tendi hala chung ko 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 she du tan chi de chibabo ka yo ra solu jamba de ka so ti ka do ne ta sabe fa tam ne sabe de ne ni ko chi ge yo sam sam lo ko mara se ju jin sang sun ko na ke yo re se te re cha na song do te ji de chibabo yo mara so lo yo ang do tan di ran di ko de che wo sen ge yo mara 규제 텐데 소소도 상선을 대부도 용거래 송고하라. 자 제바부 매부터 세버진 송고하라. 디파저데 제바부 여세 다 여생게들 내가 제한다 갑대 제한다 송고 말아. 다 여세데 껴간가 용도 세딩아도 삼을 따고라 용도 용물 따고라. 다들 삼을 따데. 제바부 여세 제바부 현다제 지그레 삼대 소소 제야데 소송도하라. 현다제 르게션 현다 챙게 연다데 되라. 아니 야서라. 몰람 기업군의 가르치군 제초라. 그 연애 강가 제셔라. 나라도 있는 소소 내가 연애 강가 야타로 당사로 템도 소소 마로. 아이 마다스타야 어디지로 비안디스.
So here, then picking up in the text, we'll begin with this quotation on 128 from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, where he says, a self that is different from the appropriated aggregate is not possible. If it were different, then it would be observed without appropriation, but it is not observed. So here we are talking in the context of selflessness, and we have this thought of an I. All of us has this sort of sense of an I that we think exists, and it somehow seems as though it is like separate and apart from the various aggregates upon which it is designated. Like we think like my body, there's this I that possesses the body, or my mind, and there's this sense of this I that is somehow different from the appropriated aggregates. Now, here, again, we have been talking about how the Buddha was famous for teaching selflessness, and there are some who have a proper kind of understanding of what it means to be selfless, and there are others who really don't understand. They fall into a kind of misunderstanding. And so we see that the Buddha teaches in accordance with the various needs of beings. There are times when he talks about there being a self, and in the context of for those who might fall into an extreme of nihilism, he talks about, well, this self needs to develop love and compassion. There is a self who cycles in samsara, and we want to get liberation from that. And so much of this is taught in order to refute the idea of there being some kind of creator. As is explained in the Rice Seedling Sutra, there is no creator, but rather we only proceed through the links of dependent origination. We have our karma that is driven by ignorance and so forth. And so this kind of process describing the way in which beings are dependently originated refutes that idea of there being some kind of creator or being some kind of like thought motivation behind a being creating other things. Like, for example, as it describes in the Rice Seedling Sutra, a sprout, for example, doesn't need to have the thought like, oh, I'm going to come about, but rather when all of the causes and conditions are present, you have the seed and all of the other sort of conditions, then a sprout will come about. And so here, we need to investigate for ourselves. We need to look, what is the self that exists? How does this self exist? Is there an existent self? This is something that we need to investigate and analyze for ourselves. If it is the case that like everything that we experience, someone else is just done for us, or the improvement of our mind or anything like that is under the power of someone else, then I guess we just would need to make prayers, right? And they would change things for us. But here, if we look and investigate, we can see that it actually, there is no such creator. And here we need to look at the way that the self actually does exist.
Oh yeah, the so that. Yeah, Kashi something you so come that somebody Pashada Tende Keba Yorwa. Ya Kashi Yanti Jide Chebabu Yona Yaga Tende Samlu Yaga Kurku Yora. Kage Songechi Manadimusa Chili Songechi Yosam Tilpalo Ke Chichi Debachashidi Koran Tendo Yora. Tatanda Dil Gasa Pachoti Koran Yakapchosa Restune Tilpalo Ke Shane Yaga Chuna Duga Chuna Kangasu Tuvesidua. Chebabu Compare degree share Karina share che two chune ti so to very share the what tendo ora the degree ora tada sujo de chebabu yo ma so che ure share tondara so de what ha kona ni degree ora tachi to de che ure share yo ma so consensus come the somebody do che de shenda che chigre sambene so kujo jago so ngan jin da tang jin da nga sam ko ranja sha ora Ti ranja shana ni ke shanda to nyu dra yo ro kondu ta ba ti chene tomba ni ma gon tsawa ne me so to ma re si gora ta yo sa de kane yo gu te le sam ta ne ta yo ma re sen chi de che ba bo sen ne so su gu jo che ba ti tso chi re ta ni ta ga tso re so tso re so sam ta da so le nga ku ju sang ye wa ge sang ye yo gu re si de so nge chen bu chi le ge do ti ton da le song ge ora 야 가시 삼로 티 파주제 파주데 데네 티체네 디고라 남발에 가시 다예 풍풍아가 다 인시고라 다딱 받치고 라운 같은데 여기도 순den게 요마라 셴바도 양 풍부게 나네 남시 다 인시로 군시 생게시 로가 셴비 균도 내게지 다 인시 같은데 요라 자고 소소 다 매시데 풍부레네 다 멤버십 텔로서 다 매나 그 멘도 삼사데 Jigna can table mendona san table manna, and da says Namshi, Tabar Shidro and get Semchidua, Titare some Nandriora, Tikeling and Namba Mamboyori, Tingarazo, Tita in some Nandrior, so some Madena. Oh, that on the day, Kanganota carrying Gorasana. Kumbutamar was Sobochida, Shebe Chachiniora, Sobocha Kayanda Marechera. Shimgicha, so and the Shebe Chakayanda Marechera. Minduachi, English dinner. And it came my Inge till a loss to your best and water te your marichera. And it on Zuzu says Medua, and she gave her. So the Zuzu says Medua. Oh, Teneta Kage make a chance on some givera. She were tishes our Pumbulet and Shendo. Touch years some givera, Yene Abudu some givera. Sobo mare, sem mare, re mare, in a till a loss of Nagitaji years and a Tijiba me. Bulletin Shabata said, "Oh, Tendea, similar sugar manner, naked sugar manner. Take cocaine and dura, Ranguneta, yours, cushion of city tare, said, Sim the she be 20 tare, said. Well, Tende, yeah, did you love that this amount? I said.
Oh. So here we all have kind of differences in terms of our dispositions, our inclinations, our desires, and so forth. And so we need to understand that these ideas that are presented should accord with the kind of dispositions and sort of desires of various beings. For example, for some, the idea of like a creator God is the best kind of teaching. This is what will be of benefit to them. If they sort of are able to put their trust in that particular figure, and maybe when difficult circumstances arise and so forth, they're able to bear with that because of that kind of belief that they have. And so then, as opposed to that, I mean, and again, this is because of the various kinds of inclinations and dispositions, mentalities of various beings that we have these different kinds of teachings. But from the Buddhist perspective, it's really taught that you need to take care of yourself, that you are responsible, you are your own master. Whereas if someone is following a teaching where there is an idea that there's some sort of self or there's some sort of creator, maybe they don't take responsibility for themselves. Now, some might need to believe in the idea of a self in order to, as a sort of temporary means. And in that way, they might be able to reduce certain kinds of afflictions. They might be able to reduce their anger or their attachment, and so forth. But unless one really gets at the idea of there not being a self, at this idea of selflessness, you're leaving the sort of root cause of all of the problems untouched. So when it comes to really accepting this and accepting that idea of selflessness, it comes with a great responsibility. We are then responsible for ourselves. So here, as has been identified, a self that is different from the aggregates is not a suitable kind of a proposition, something that is entirely different. But we see that even within the Buddhist schools, there are those that would say that, well, it is actually all of the aggregates all together, that is the self. And there are others that look at the mental consciousness and say, no, the mental consciousness, that is the self, or the foundational consciousness, that is identified as the self. But if it is the case that for someone, maybe they are uncomfortable with the idea that, well, things are selfless in the sense that there's nothing that you can point to as being the self. It's something that is merely designated. If that causes a kind of fear or trepidation, then maybe thinking that the mental consciousness is the self, or identifying the foundational consciousness is the self, that is temporarily the best kind of solution for them. So when we look at this idea of I, it is something that, again, is designated on the basis of these aggregates. So we could have two sort of parts to that. There's the body, the physical body, and then there's the mind. And it's fairly easy to identify that, well, the body is not the I, is not the self. But if it is the case that when we then say, oh, well, the mind can't be the self either, that there's actually sort of nothing that we can point to, for those that are temporarily unable to bear that, who would get afraid, it is okay for them to, at that point, accept that there is, like, the mental consciousness is the self, or the foundational consciousness is the self.
Oh yeah. 당은 저들 로긴다 뭐기도. 대다야 자실에서도 다네 녀를 렘발에 셴도 대바 니마예서도 다데서라 풍부 nga yora sogi 풍부 좋아한 도시 넘버 10 풍부 nga yora 다네 녀를 배 풍부 nga래 셴도 요 말에서 뭐 셴다시 다데 발라나 셴고 보세브나시 라바예미나시 코라 카가체시고라 뭐 셴도 요 말에서 다네 녀를 렘발에 셴도 대바 니마예서 풍부 nga 보디샤 제 마인게지 다지 요 말와 다네 녀를 렘발에 셴도 대바 니마예서 shen yuwa ina, kete shen na le meba songyo rina songdo mes. Kumbu nga bo tele, su dan, sheba dan, rwa, tezu le lo so, da chi yuwa na sigo ra. Kete shen na le meba songyo rina. Ane da ngon zindu, pungbu chi kanya rwa chi songne, char ne, ane tele tene da asipa da gado, te da kukuma rwa sigo ra. Nanzu mere tonda sopo tonsuna o te chichi re, te tashi re, te tundu re, te ta re, te pala re sikira sopo tondu. Sopo la tena paa tagdo, gore chi tonsuna, palang gore chi tonda, ngamara chi yugu chi suna, o te te re sha sam tagdo. Go de palang ke re o mara. Go charshi chene te palang re stagora. O te indu karsure. Tende ta kwe me duwa sigora. Kura kari imba de ta pa de palang re se. Munzi chukura, sokpuli tene, sopu pala marwa, pala marane ani sokpuli tene, di pala chadu sa, sopu pala yin samge wa mara kwe, sopu chane o di pala do samge wa. Kari singe masire, di kari kurke yo mara, taga cha shakiri mado, jiga chan di laga rida sesno kore stone, chito, o resha, taga cha shari mado. Che di kari laga re sige wa se, kol ten labsa sana, di nyambe sunu cha, jiren tanya, taga zore, tele tene kuta nalo de sada kunda yose ji te sonda te laga sigarese ta che jura ati inde pumbule shendo yona pumbu ngunji ma char mago ache kuran takda ngunji che ko te yo mare sigora chilo ne tange zo sokbole te ta ta ura soso rabjen soso sokbole te ne ta ura samsal samba mikira tere samba kyo mudasa tere nagidu samsa soso nazo te shiso ne nga nagidu samsa 소화단 두시단 두시 딘들 때는 봤다고도 공주세대는 저런 공주세고 야오면에서 맞잡고시고 삼세대도 공주 당하게도 tra도던 데서도 그래서 간거 대시를 되어라 그럴 때는 봤다고요 풍부의 셴도 다시요나 뭐 셴지요나 다발라나 셴네 데타른데 발라른데 뭐부르 세부르세 가가가가 문지지야요 거라 김면도와 소소소소 삼단데 요 말은 미그 추다도 요 말아 Tiene un boleto siempre está yo maresiora. Ya. Tan ni vale vale siendo te bani mai que de siendo yo na. Ene siendo kaga chene sungli na se. Kumbu songa la made ba che che sungju yo gura, ngen jin yo gura. Kumbu chara made ba chi chare yo gura. Kumbu ngen jin ba la made ba shenda chi kur kadul ngen ji chi yo gura, jin yo gura te me do as gura. O te kasi lapsare o te chi lapsane. Ya.
So here, as it says in this quotation from Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way, so a self that is different from the appropriated aggregates is not possible. If it were different, then it would be observed without appropriation, but it is not observed. So here, these 5 aggregates are form, feelings, discrimination, mental formations, and consciousness. If it were the case that the I, the self, were of a different nature, a different essence than those appropriated aggregates, then it would have to be something that is totally separate. Something like when we have like an ox and a cow, or a blue and yellow. So when we think about it, we can't find something apart from, aside from the aggregates. That we can identify as being the I, the self, because it is the case that really the I is just designated upon the aggregates. Like for example, if we see like the head of an ox, we can say, oh, there's an ox. It's not as though we think that the head is the ox, but rather on that basis, we are able to designate something that, oh, there is an ox. Or like I can say, this is a temple. And then, just by showing the door, and we know that there is, a space inside with various images and so forth. And that is enough for the existence of the temple. We can say that decisively. And we can look at it and see that really it's just a convention. If we try to point out, well, where exactly is this? We're not able to find it. But just that level of saying this is the temple designated on a particular basis, that suffices for its existence. So when we look at our own self, when we say like, oh, I am sick, or oh, I am unhappy, I am angry, and so forth, it is on the basis of one of those 5 aggregates, of one of our feelings, or a mental consciousness, or a body. If it were separate, if it were the case that we had this I, that we're totally separate and apart from the aggregates, then we should be able to observe that. We should be able to see something that is apart from those aggregates, or speak about a self independent from the aggregates. So we could identify and look at, okay, over here's the aggregates and over here is the self, but that is not the case.
Oh yeah, that did it. So young Randi Ngoma Namjin Devatar Sidwa. That Dagagi Karsura. Tutama Shanda Shana, Tawa Chibu Rameta Sera. Kumbule Tension Beta is a Kumbungati, Be Logache Tele Losta Yesera. In this Shetua, Disha Saja. The number Sanja, but Tomba Sanja Chumde de Chinju Inaya, Yakonzu Karsivarsana. Ngoma Namjes, Ngobo, Rangone Yore, Ngobo Tembatuba Yore, Roa, O Tezu Senge Tezu, Devatar, Nyoalembe Pumbule, Shen Ta Yoba Miru, Dikeling Yomar, Nyoalembe Pumbule Pengo Tade, Pumbunga de Logasha, Kurata de Pe Logachi, Yus, Tapalana, Shikava, Yus, Dikeling Yomara, Nambe to the Mosuja. Ngoma Namje Devatar, Nyoalembe Pumbule, Shen Ta Yoba Miru, Chiriben Devatizurati, Rungumares, Tatakwatakita. Pumbu Namle Kanshi, Rangwene Trube, Dainonia, Pumbu Nanechi, Yoko, te Yovati, Nayoratina Nechi, the Dai Kugre, some Biore. Timan Tina, Damana, the Takawayore some. Tina Naga, the Dai Singura, Pumbu Naga Tadis. Hachitina and Yijinam Shiki, Twin the Tadis. Hashitia Maratina, look, cushion number Shiba Namjune ko sem chingdi tai gamzu na shipe tembo che de den ge shore tire ro kunshin nam shi se kewa ma ju me ke ma ju yu ju de shida me chen ge yung gu de shida me ke me gu lo ma ju ge sem ama chi ro ti ta re se kunshin nam shi ta re se tin de se ora hu bu na ne chi yo go re se so go da shibe na ne chi yo go ma do ani men do a tile shandani wa ma ro tin de sam ge ore se ra Miru Pumbu Namle Kanshi Ramune Trube, Taino Yamnasi, Pumbu Nanichi Tayin Kudose, Pumbule Tension Bepe Kagachin Tachi de Homara Tesina, Tedana Ta de Nyoalembe Pumbu Namdran Sam to Sebe, Tandi Uma Bada Tezulu Nation Shegora, Dira Luce de Uma Belu Nation Shegora, Uma Bata Ngobu, Ramune Yobama Otsolia Shegora. Tedana Ta de Nyoalembe Pumbu Namdran Sam to say. And da Pumbunga Chibare Sanchera, Da Seneda, Pumbunga Seneda, Pumbu Seneda, Chibare de Tuasura. Tanda de Da Pumbunga de Nyalang Jache, Da de Lemba Bosch, Tinde Shagura, take him to Pumbunane, Da de Nane, Nyalang Jaganane, Da de Do. Ketana, Da Nyalembe, Pumbu Namdran to say best. Pumbuta, she Ming Medata, Madu Tanda Chibare, Ming Namdran de Tuasura. Imbe ta rangshin ke yebara mawa teme ba jurshin se pungbi namdra tam du sebe ta rangshin ke yebara mawa teme ba ta rangshin ke mese tinane tsene che ni mese te de me do sam gora te tanda me do se ora ka de me ma to ora ta ino nyana te ta na ta te nyawale be pungbi namdra tam du sebe ta rang lu si ora sebe ta rangshin ke yebara mawa teme ban jurshin se ane ta se rangshin ki ye se loga she me duwa kumbu ye tebe ta re to ma do ta se loga me duwa she ra kumbu na ne na nyawa lemba boda nyawa langje ni ke sha ko me duwa se go ra ye ba ma teme ban jurshin se kumbu ni ta da kumbu ta re de to kumbu na ne ta kumbu da rang ge ngoye tebe rangshin chi yin na se ta de pumbu da rangshin rangi ngoyo tube rangshin chi ina se ora rangi ngoyo tube de konju ngoyo ma kailing ge ora tigi se ora rangshin chi ina nyelengi pumbu gyun che ba da chi ina se ora ta pumbu da rangi ngoyo tube rangshin chi ina se ne pumbu saba yongura sobo de jine me lu sobo saba yongure ene ya te zo sone ji zuo de yo ma de yan xian dai ji jiao la sun de pong bu sa ba yong gu de so bo pe ka ka yong gu de wa ti ina ne ka su re sna rang ge ngo de be rang xi chi ina ni len ji 풍부 균체바다. 예린 풍부의 균체가 센터를 시선은 풍부 균체로라 님도 마야지마 겨라서 풍부 사바실라 그러. 배사바사장아 매 균마로. 예린게 풍부 균체바다. 풍부 균가시 다도 주라서지. 야나 풍부 나네 찍더니 다도 주라서지. 풍부 긴지 지다르 제바다 풍부 간데 긴지 제바이나 되나시 다데 긴지 제고라. 네 풍부 사바사발레 두고도 나마 교가마 맹게 균찬 맹게 사바실레 온고도 티네다 다데 사바사발레 두라 아니 나마다 시마니데 저 맹게를 차고도 균기도 맹게 차고도 긴지 제바 풍부 소부 긴지 제바 나시게 사도 게 사도 매바 차로 나마디 균멤버 제 사바지고라 어디내시 차그래서라 긴지 제바 타와다 샤야 냐왈라제 풍부다 냐왈렘바부 지인바라 타와서 견이 아니 냐왈랑자 풍부되다 렘바보니 지그래서 하시거라 아니 디 송게되다 랭게되다 풍부랑자 되다 냐왈렘바보데 지이나 네 제바보다 샤베 유유된기 집어 차려라 아테나 자겐도도 자마수도 자네 코팅이 찍인 바타도 셔르텐데 용도 어디봐도 지교나 만들어서 야
So here, there are those non-Buddhist schools, other kinds of tenant schools that assert that there is some sort of permanent, unitary, and autonomous self. So it's not logical for there to be some kind of self apart from the aggregates, whether it is those that assert some kind of permanent, unitary, autonomous self, or as it says here, furthermore, it is not logical to assert, as do the Buddhist essentialists, and that would be those who assert that there is some kind of essential true existence, a self that is separate from the appropriated aggregate. So here, there can't be some sort of self that is apart from, aside from the appropriated aggregates. Again, that's not something that can be observed. And so any sort of self then needs to be with the aggregates, or like among the aggregates. So there are those, and I'll read this next sentence, any self presumed to exist from its own side among the aggregates would in fact be merely a synonym for the aggregates. So thus to say, as an essentialist would, that there is an inherently existent self would be senseless. So here, again, as it says that if it is the case that that the self is among the aggregates, is sort of like within the aggregates, as some assert, either the mental consciousness or the continuum of the mental consciousness, or something like the sort of stable basis for the clarity of mind, this fundamental consciousness, they would assert that, well, it has to be something among the aggregates that is the self. Now, if it were the case, then, from the Madhyamaka position, those two would become just the same. So therefore, it would be like the self would be sort of like a synonym for the aggregates, because there's no self that's separate from the aggregates. But if they're the exact same, if the self is the exact same thing as the aggregates, then it becomes a mere synonym. And the sort of idea of the thing that is appropriated, these aggregates, and then the appropriator, the self, would collapse. It would be senseless then, thus to say, as an essentialist would, that there is an inherently existent self would be senseless. So here, then if the aggregates were the self, or were the self itself, or the self and the aggregates were essentially existent and of one intrinsic nature, then it would follow that in whatever way the aggregates were produced and perished, whether the appropriated aggregates were destroyed or a new continuum of the aggregates arose and so on, the production and perishing of the self would have to be just the same. So here, if there is then nothing separate and apart aside from the aggregates that is the self, but rather they have to exist. The self must be among the aggregates. And as essentialists would assert that they have to be sort of truly existent, then we would have the problem that the aggregates, as they are produced and perish, as we can see, like the aggregates of this life are something that will end at the end of this life and will take up new aggregates. But that would be untenable for them to be part of the same continuum. They couldn't be related to the same continuum and have this kind of essential existence identity. And so the one who would take up those aggregates and the aggregates themselves would collapse if it were the case that the self were the aggregates. But if the self is something apart from the aggregates, or it's identified with one continuum of the aggregates and then that perishes, there would have to be a new beginning. So as it points out here, that if the aggregates and the self are the same, then the production and perishing of the self would have to be just the same. So here, the one who takes up those aggregates, if it's like a human in one life and then a god in the next life, if those are essentially truly existent as such, they couldn't be members of the same continuum. So these are some of the faults that would arise.
Oh yeah. That is zashi long chang do gombo lu
Mm.
tu ke zashi long. Tada ya zashi le se do. Tada le shen ma ye se do. Da de so da rang ne tu be da de rang ne ye be da de se. Nyawa le be phung bu le ngo shen do be ta ba la na shin ngo bo se ba na she ka ga yo ma re se go ra. Tada le shen ma ye nye len ji phung bu se go ra. Ne shen ma ye se da de so ra rang ne tu be da de se go ra. Tanda rangwine truba kaya lenge te nyamdo keshe yora. Sa ta rangwine yona, rangwine truba ta te, ene nyawa lembe pungbu le, shendo pe ngo tate she che, ta pala na shi ngo bo seba na shi che yo ma re se wara. Tata len le shen ma ye se. Ngo tate she yo ma re se. Tene nye le nye jam me se. Ene nye te rangwine truba ta te, nye le ji pungbu na ne, nye le ji pungbu te truba se ne, te ya ma re se re. Tene nyele nye jame, rangwene trupe taade, nyele je pungpu nane suu da chiga maare, soa ndushi nafshi pungpu da chiga maare shara. Shenya maare chiga maare shigora. Teta lenle shenya maare tene nyele nye jame se, shitas. Tati tene nyele nye jame se doa, tene nyele rangwe taade, nyele je pungpu yena, nyele pungpu 다 니치그래도라. 근데 다그네시 풍부 사바치 계속나 경아마 맹게게 교아마 맹게게 풍부 경 사바치 렉서나 근데 다데 사바치 렉거라. 근데 다 교아는 가마네 경투도 용게 멤버십도 다 사바사바 렉거리. 진짜 저 경영도 대다 렌레 셴마이스 베 셴마레세 모셴이나 모셴이나 풍부 때저 그 깨와다 직바다 내발라서 자와치그라 속부 자와치그래 소화게 자와치그래 콘도 자와치그래 그런 드레싱 벼를 타도를 터서 내가 지도 다 이렇게 겨워요 말에 군이 배가가라 따방을 나시라 근데 다 자와치에 맹게 자그래 속부 로스는 소체스는 다 소체 말에 어 속부 고제전 로스는 다 두고 뭐 속부를 말해서 나서는 다 나기요 말아. 다를 자매 버린도래. 다 긴지기 지에매 다 딱베스도 그 내가 맹게 쳐도다. nga samsung nga dugi nga degi samsung log mi yi nga de lega che me sing ge nam ga tong be sun de tak be sun de chi lia nga su sam de ti sam ge maro se nga na ge nga cha ge nga ya ko ye nga tu ko ye sam ge ora o ti de da phung bu ni pe shen ye na ne phung bu 자와 제바 때 상마 겨와다 직바다 개발라 소바 겨와라 소바 나와라 소바 때저 상마데 다그 자원 너무 말해 샘 콘도 사스는 다 콘도 사요 말해 봐 샘게는 양의 제스는 다 양의 제기와 말해 거기에 개발요 말해 거기는 응앙가라서 뭐 세븐 내시라 다 방나 내시라 주도요 말아 근데 다들 개개 팬매동 게 서울에다 Chawa Menke, Yana Tongba, Ravura Nashi, Kagame Yana Chitawas, Latawachi, Yuser, Shimato, Penny Dachi, Longche, that in the Kage Machine Chadura, or teaching Gura. Tatalene Shen Inaswada, Shemares, Nileko Mare, Pumpuda China, Nia Tama Bure Dure, Netagnasia, Pumpu Saba Saba Leduza, Joangamane, Dirikiawata, Shimadia, Kiawa Tune Dry Mavashawda, Soba Saba Saba Leangura. Oh, Tijulamia, Madra.
So, again, there would be many faults, such as the consequence that the aggregates that are appropriated and the self that is the appropriator would be the same, as have been described. And then Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on the middle way states, thus, the self is not different from the appropriator, nor identical to the appropriator. Here it isn't as though like the essentialists assert some kind of existence from its own side. If we have aggregates and then a self that are both existent from their own sides, then they become something totally separate. So we would have like an ox and a cow, and or blue and yellow that can be identified totally independently of each other. But it's not, yeah, and I'm not sure on this. So it's also not identical to the things that are appropriated. So here, as we have seen, it's not the case that the self could be totally separate and apart, distinct from the appropriated aggregates, but nor is it just those appropriated aggregates alone. If it were the case that the self is the aggregates, in the same way that we say take on a new form, we take on new aggregates with a new rebirth, then that would mean that there's a new self of a totally new and different nature. So here, it is the case that the self is designated on the basis of the various aggregates, but as is being established here, it's not something wherein the self is identical to the aggregates, nor is it totally separate and apart from the aggregates. If it were the case that it were totally separate and apart from the aggregates, then we couldn't speak of like, oh, I am moving, because that's the form aggregate which is doing that, or I am angry, I am sick, all of those kinds of things. Basically, the self would become impotent. It's totally devoid of any kind of function. Our aggregates have the ability to carry out various functions and activities, but our self, if it is disconnected from those aggregates, it would be sort of like something like inert space. We wouldn't have any kind of relationship between the aggregates, our body and mind complex, and this so-called self. And so all of the activities of the aggregates would be like totally unrelated to the I, to the self. There would be no sort of benefit or harm that came from the aggregates and then the self. And so that would sort of lead us to say, well, okay, then the self is just this permanent thing that doesn't really do anything, that doesn't have any functionality or doesn't cause any benefit or harm. So that's really not in a reasonable kind of position to take. But at the same time, if we have a kind of self that is, and then as the second part says, nor is the self then identical to the appropriator. So I'm not, here, neither is the self then just the aggregates. We've seen the faults that would come from trying to identify and say that the self just is those very aggregates upon which it is designated. So it can't be something totally separate and apart because of the lack of relationship, but nor could it be just the exact same thing. If that were the case, then the I, the self, would have no continuity. There would be no continuum of that, because of the perishing of the aggregates would mean that then the self has also perished and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Or Tata, Tata Lele Shema Yisira, Rangwine Trube Shemare, Shayina, but Chichil Tuba Mevan draw your mother. Tabalana Shikuni dog the Meb Shadow. Rangwine Trube Shayina, Demit and Shed and do the draw to the Lella Shamais. Shayinani, Chichil Tu Mother Pumbu Chow Chava Tag Chow Chow do Mother Tadi, Takwanda Boat and Drifts on the Shadow, Lega Pine Mega Shadow. Then a Yelling Yaja Mess, Rangwine Trube China, Yelling Pumbu Yena. And the young Yelling Pumbu Sobo Saba Saba Kikdo, Kundi Kawangamani Umudua, Yanti Chasona, Joachamadia, Yelling Pumbu Saba Yungrape. Tina she died in Kawangamane, Shima Kuntu, Jurkicha, Yoya de Rigimara, Tikuri Yomara, Kunchima de Yomara. Then the Yelling Yajame, Yelling Pumbu Yanani, Yelling Pumbu the Chigden do the Tina round to be Chigina, and the Pumbu. Chawa Chidar Chevana Shita Chawa Chegura. And the Pumbus Meme start to Rachonchina, Kyongama Bebasa China, Tade Kyonga make Kunima Tuti Mayumba Savasi Lekura. Oh, Tika Yodesi. The Tanda de Tombani Shegura. Shuna Sheg in Bedabada, Tunga, Chambada, Nichi, Chanju, Saint Tonyum Singakanga, Chegum Jare, Chegum. Tambope de Tombani Chegum Chigora. The Marati Nekando to request some time. Cheba Chigora, or Tenetati Medoa, some to Chena Comgiora. Mancha Chegum Rexona. Tashina the Tambo to Gwenet, the Jogum Janya Chedeora. They took the Loga Kotugura. They took Sana and the Tombani that is a Cheba Chidoni. Shine they told her how don't Cheba Chine pay out Chavara. Tit and Dalia Comgiora, Shinetos the Coyate. Or Timado Cochidan Shine. Something as a temple jajan, the net and Sunday in the Shavajin, Sanjera, Samgira. Mado Tico Hatserum talking as a Mecumbe Gagana, Hatserum Busheshora, Hatserum Buchos. Thing is a temple jagger someday. Shibada, you are so many lot of the Society to the Tambuki Kene. Thing is in a current that Sebu Cheche. Namgata, Namshata, Messis, Dushim, and Dushim, Yora. Oh, Tendene de Doa. So till it can things in the temperature of. You know, Tim Mecumbe next to do till my give a show cigar. The things in Janyamara. Now, but things in comedy any chamba, and you change some to detol come. Ya Jetaro. Corajanya come to the cable mambo to stay there. That's some Yona Menace or the Chatayora. This on the Hatcher and Bunam Sukiam Sigdo. Or this on the Chegum Peke Chambure. Chegum the Chen and assembly Goategra. Imbare, Imbasho de Shanet, Gayamare. Pulichi de Abuderate. Cheba Chen is Samtana or Tati one redua, Tiremadosam, round to Betachiana, Ubuda Chigre, Padere, Ubudachi in a Dumare Candidate. Ubuda Beran, a Tade and a peg one Busevna Shire. Did draw a Kemador. Takarchura. Umbula tene, Tasha Agore. Luda Semni Latene. Lu Tata, you are a teacher, whatever the Taka Chacha, but I do the Tade, do Tana, do Ta Conduce. Tisha, you're 10 and talk about some shower, Sigora. Umbuda, there's only 10 and talk about some shower. We can't get a Tachibu Mare. Tandanganzo Tali Segura. A tin and shita sobo. Wombukanga Sangan loose and children to go to a Yomara, Lawa, Kanga children to go to a Yomara. Tade Miwasana. Chilo Pagwata now looked at tended so and a coach to be out of matter. So what the Miwan star mother, Miwan did a share the children to go to a Yomara. Pagwat in the Maret, in the Maret, sat in the Maret, in a loom joint in the Maret. Chikango Kanga Chibare. Rangwin and Mela, Rangaduma. Yeah, that's it like Mountas one. Oh, yeah.
So, here again, if it were the case that this self and the appropriated aggregates were totally different, totally distinct, then they would become unconnected. So that's the kind of fault that incurs from there being a sort of, and again, as the essentialists would assert, that there's existence from their own side. So if there's a self that exists from its own side and it's totally different from the appropriated aggregates aggregates which exist from their own side, then it would be like unconnected, unrelated. And if it is the case then that the self is the aggregates, as it says here, and the self is neither different from the, I'm going to say appropriated, nor is it identical to the appropriated. So if it were the case that the self were identical with the aggregates, then there would be like a new self in every life. As we follow the sort of perishing of those previous aggregates, there could be no continuum. There could be no continuity of various lives, because then with each new set of aggregates, you'd have a new self. So it's not the case that these can be totally unrelated, because again, when we talk about the self doing various things, this is only independence upon the aggregates. We can't speak of a self that is separate and apart from the aggregates. When we talk about like being I'm angry or I'm hungry or whatever it might be, it is only independence upon those aggregates that we can speak about a self. And so this is something where when we are reflecting upon this, we're engaging in what's called analytical meditation, which is so very important. Here we're talking about emptiness. And when we see in the texts, when they talk about things like impermanence or love and compassion and patience and all of these various topics, they're primarily analytical meditation kind of topics where we engage in a kind of investigation, aside from calm abiding, aside from trying to establish serenity through that kind of placement meditation. Most of the meditation that we do is analytical, is really thinking about things, is engaging in that kind of investigation and analysis, because that's the kind of meditation that really moves our mind. As we talk about in the sort of 8 states that lack freedom, there is the state of a long-lived God, referring to those kinds of beings who've developed just extremely subtle kind of meditative stabilization, such that they are born in like the 4th concentration or in the states of the formless realms, from sort of endless space, endless consciousness, nothingness, neither discrimination nor non-discrimination. These beings can be in this kind of meditative stabilization for eons without having any other kind of thought. And so although they have refined their meditative concentration to an extreme degree, this is a state that is seen as lacking freedom, because you just remain in that kind of concentration for eons. There's no other activity that happens. So it is really crucial for us to engage in analytical meditation. It is the way that we gain certainty about these various points, by thinking about, oh, is it really like this? Is this how the self exists? Is this how it is? And when we investigate for ourselves, then we can gain the kind of certainty that, again, really moves our mind. So here, when we talk about the self being dependent upon the aggregate, that it is something that is designated merely on the body and mind, this is, we're talking about the kind of selflessness of the person, but this is really the same for all various objects. When we look at like our hand or our foot or something like our eye faculty, where is that eye faculty exactly? Can we point to the thing that is that eye sense power? Well, when we look and we go through like the various skin and the various layers and so forth, we can't find anything to point to, but yet we can see. And so here, to understand the way in which, although phenomena don't exist from their own side, they exist in a manner that is merely designated. This is something that we come to an understanding of based upon our own investigation and analysis.
Hola.
Okay.
Tade deso kete pombo dae na ketan jikba chen tu jors. Ke chen bu do. Ta rangwe ne trube ta de rangwe ne trube ye na so ra. Ta rangwe ne trube ta de so ra. Kete pombo de ta rangwe ne trube ta ye na so ra. Ane sobo ge soji pombo la sobo pombo che dare kinji cheba na shi ta ge te na shi kinji chebure so ra. Kewa lande sato ko ke te je yunshima dra yo marwa. Tina shi kinji chebure se kete pombo da ye na. Pombo che dare kinji cheba na shi ta kinji chebure se. Te na sobo saba lepso na ta saba sa ja 叫俺们给军民给打那个多吧，这算哦，这些，给他碰不那么来先碰不成，碰不来等先吧，让我呢准备打的碰不来白，我不舍不那些看看有呢，让我都准备说说玩意呢，让我都准备说说的，这些里跟着要嘛的，那碰不给经济单叫我去吧，什么打个叫我去吧，买不就的说的，对对。然后呢，准备打的有那碰不到几多要嘛的，碰不到他的多要嘛的是，就的，对那然后呢，准备打的没多少说的。然后呢，准备打药嘛的，打没是吧？是那打药的是打个的是呢，碰碰啊了，带你怕打发生，流到生命的哇，流到生命的有的没打，但这打一打是怕打些了，他光是叫叫把的打个叫叫，带你打发生下午了，哦，这下嘛都对，那这碰不了，等先别打药打完一些看看用不了的，带你打发生了打下头不要嘛的。我们把这送个多，等你打过咱们小区的马先生，哎，你碰不来，等先别打就让我去打些了，就是用个了。等你打过咱们打下面都开始洗个了，说不的人呢打嘛的，给了现在打要嘛的，等你打过咱们打的碰不来，等你怕老下嘛的每个什么下了，你妈我那让叫去，这就说的，让我不啥不去做的。说不得说的吧，现在写不着，现在写不着。他写吧，慢一点说啊，慢一点，我不啥吧去做的，听不？得了打死个人，得面对这些个的，真的忙不了的，我不刚刚接不了的，我常没接不了。康巴的现在的高大给工接不他妈去，但是人家妈的，给了钱都要嘛的，但是了单的打，你这个多康巴的，康巴那这个早有看看，这个多大个真下我的噻。哦，这是了，那就说写送不到罗下。
Mm. So, this is reiterated in the following quotation, where again, if the self were the aggregates, in the sense that the self and the aggregates exist objectively from their own side, then it would have to arise and cease, as in when we couldn't have any sort of continuity. The self would be perished, would have perished with the perishing of those aggregates, and we would take up a new self with the new aggregates that we take. So there would not be the possibility of there being any kind of continuum of the self. So that's not a viable option. But if it were different from the aggregates, again, in an objectively existent kind of a way, then it would not share the characteristics of the aggregates. So all of the sort of activities of the aggregates, everything that we do with our physical body or our mind, would not be done by the self, because they are totally different and separate. The self is something apart, aside from the aggregates. And so thereby we couldn't talk about the self doing anything that the aggregates had done. And so here, when we think about it in this way, we reflect on it, we can establish that there is no such objectively existent self. But does that mean then that there is no self whatsoever? Well, there is a self, but the self exists as something that is a mere designation, that is existent by way of merely dependently designating that. And there are those who aren't able to understand that. And so therefore there's a kind of fear at positing a merely designated self. And they think that there must be something that we could point to, that we could identify as being the I or the self. But so when it comes to a kind of a self in the way that it appears to us as something that is objectively existent, we can't actually find something within the aggregates. So, our physical body, that is form, that is material. The self is not something that is material. It doesn't exist as the form. And again, the self is something that is designated upon a combination of our body and our mind. So it's not like just identified with the form, but nor is our self just consciousness. And so therefore it is asserted to be something something that is a non-associated compositional factor, as in it is something that is designated upon form and mind, but is neither of those. And this is something that is applicable not just to the person, but to any sort of phenomena, something like a house. We can talk about a house in dependence upon walls and windows and doors and the framing and so forth, but there's nothing that we can point to and say that is the house. Yet we can speak about a house in a perfectly functional kind of a way. And so too with the self, there isn't no self whatsoever, but the self exists as a mere dependent designation.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that is the some shadow. Degree Lobe Papa Lavasudo, degree Rawa Meba de Tenatani Yomaese. Lobe de Sama, Rawa to Tuba Yomare. Rawa to Tuba Tangi Yomar, Sama Jaira. Lobe Rawa Yeme, Rawa to Tuba, Rangine Tuba. Shala Tushin Delne, Shakunge Maiba. Kokorangune Chili Zugutu Seba, Tacton Sending Yevara. You men and Angaran de Deda Sute, he was Skugati Yomare. Over Rawa Yeme say, Yami. Ra, Marsara. Oh, Tarawa to Tubayo, Maesoda. The good Rawa Meba, the Tenatani, Masotirida. Chotamje Tani to Maduse, Tata Maduse Tilakore. This Samatamje, Rawa to Tubayoma, Rangune Tubayoma, Rangune Tubetani Yoma, Rangune Tuberanging Oyoma, Resora. The good Rawa Tenatani Mas. Oh, Tene. The Rawa to Tubayoma, the Tension Repertoire. Then I talk about some shower. Koran Rawan children young girl mare. Then I talk about some. Najuti Dinaligo Sanje, Donade, Tipali Naliora, teaching Timeka, Niga Budota, Convent those Dojimara. Tajichawa, Tuji Semse, Kenetan, but some Namjing Azulo language doa, something around you, something. Soboda sem that the Shita do Megere some coda. Or the Tashi of a Tuji Sems, Kenny Tower you at this, Majit in the Tower. Do she Pumbu did all this? Do she Pumbunget and a Latin days round with Asio Mardasura? Do she Pumbu did on the Tilla Simja Yamais? Simja Rawashi Oma. Aneta Mary was all Mare. You are a Dasa. That's a Tasa to Dijuati. Dilasimje. Chitariana saw Namla ten and Shinda Chubata, Tishin Pumbu Namdene, Kunzu Simja Shechudo Sigua. Oh, Shinda, Namduta, that is not a number to the Yabuda. Namduta, Motada, and a Karkardo, Computer, Tezo. No, I paid that as a door. Chizun Namdu, Dina Chala, the Pakbata, and a Rayamara. Dinamdu rest those who say Omara. Tezola ten pa number Tezo Kanga Soso Lega Chigore, Tezo Kanga Tonga, number period, number publish Chora. Number Tange me Yora, Tina Miche Yora, and a Kaja Kaja Yora. They are Kondu Legacy and number periods, number Babsida, the Shakuda, or Tinashi. Then I talk with some shower, Tejada. Children to go to Sarang when they say Yomare, no Kanga Tara. Oh, this is you and Jada.
So here, as the master Aryadeva has said, I believe it's in his commentary. Anyway, so the master Aryadeva has a quotation where he says that all of this is lacking in autonomous existence, independent existence, and therefore it is selfless. So here, because all phenomena are not, don't have this kind of independent, objective, autonomous existence from their own side, there is no established self. There is no kind of a self on those bases. So here he is clearly identifying that the meaning of selflessness is to lack that kind of objective, autonomous existence from its own side. And so here, as opposed to negating existence entirely, this establishes that phenomena phenomena are merely dependently designated. So as, and it will come here very soon in the text, citing a sutra from actually the Pali tradition. So this is common to both Theravada and Mahayana. This idea of self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. We have this kind of thought of I that holds these aggregates as if they had some kind of objective existence. But this is a wrong view. As it says, these composite aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. So when we look within the kind of basis of designation of the I, for example, you can't find something to point to and say, this is the self. But yet there is functionality. So just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon a collection of parts, we use the convention living beings in dependence upon the aggregate. And so this kind of understanding doesn't negate existence outright, but rather shows us how things actually do exist. So it is in the way of being dependent designations. We can look at these days, we have lots of objects we can take as objects of analysis. Planes are good to look at, or we could look at computers or iPads or cars or whatever it might be. Like a plane, when we look at a plane, if we try to identify, well, what is that plane? Looking from the outside, all of the various kinds of machinery that make that up, we can't find anything that we can point to and say, well, that thing, that is the plane. But yet someone flies the plane. We can ride on a plane. A plane goes up, it comes down, it can carry people, get them to their destination, and so forth. So even despite the fact that we can't point to something and say, this is that thing, the thing exists in a manner of a mere designation, and yet, and within that is able to function entirely. So there's nothing to point to in terms of our own sort of personal self or that of other objects, but yet we can speak of all of these things functioning.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that is what. Oh, that is Jagum Cheche, Tende, Samla Tanche, Neta Rawe, Namjunga, Samla Kode, Tina Shimidoa, some Jogora, Simpashana, Timidoa, some young one, Samlata, Yonet and the Yogore, Tina Shinamju Sambanashi, Yonakawa, Pumbuchi, Tinde Samlata, Ya, Tara, to Tibetati, Medoa, some Tinde Comera, Tele Jagum Sera. Oh, they don't buy it, the Kanga Jagum Pekachambura. Jagum man assembly joy take Mare. Chichi red as oh, in some days are Matoke Mara. Or Tinde Kongone, some Lenal, some Corgo, in a social, some Corgo, in a social Chabachagura. Chambada Niji, some Kanga, Shunchimone Shebe Comja Sama. Jagum Zochin Shakwe Kare Shara. Oh, Tingudoa. The embassy, what did you look down this one?
So here, this is really important that we do analytical kind of meditation, looking at the self as we usually think it exists and coming to determine that actually it doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us. This is something where we think about it, we reflect, use reasonings, and then based upon that analytical meditation, we can place our minds on that kind of understanding. And then we engage in that again and again. And this is the way in which we should approach most all of the topics within the great texts. We really need to look at things like, selflessness and love and compassion and so forth. These are all analytical meditations. We need to engage with the way that we normally think and actually use our kind of analytical thinking to apply that and to change that. These are the kinds of meditations that really create a change in our mind.
Oh, yeah. That is why. Oh, the embassy, that Rawan to Tibeta mes, Rawan to Tibesu me, Rawan to Tibeta me, Time, Rome, Reja Kanga Chajurida, Tachibu de Mevsi to Shanda or some Yomare. Tag and Dushin and Shishandal charge some do, Tambu Tag told Samatan de Yora. Chidarki Tag and Dushin, Shiba de Shikun, Lurchar Charge. Tag told somebody of course on the Titango Kanga Chibode. Maybe Kanga around to do a meva, then a talk about some Shana Mato. Chuktu to a Chuktuba, talks about chess about Mevate. Kanga Chibora. Oh, did you love? What is to the
So, here, we should again this self as it appears to us. This is not something that exists in the way that it appears. And so it is said that as we perceive or as we understand the self, so as lacking any kind of autonomous, independent, objective existence, so we should understand all other phenomena. So it is through this kind of investigation and analysis that we begin with in terms of our own self, but then we apply that, we move that kind of understanding to all other phenomena.
Oh yeah. 다 지답이 다 유추시다. 다 원에 시그래. 다나 다요 말베스 다 요르 다세. 다지 라와장기 매레 풍불에 tension 라원에 주베 다 매레. 다 때네 다보 삼비 다 유시 티시요라. 다 유시. 니와렘베 풍부 다 마이제라. 풍불에 ngom 제 현도야 다 매나. 대단하 다 매바니도 다 매그래도 아섬 지겨라. 풍부나는 가 요리 되나는 가에 따르면도 텔레베 제신 현다지 다면도 다 다면도 아스나 시고라 도바쿠요라. 다 매바니도 시나. 아니 녀알렘베 풍부 요라 녀알렘바부 다 매밤브라 매바 마르스 녀알렘베 풍부간도와 근데 롱체체도와 롱정게체 거라 녀알렘베 풍부도와 풍부랑게 풍부레테네 롱정게체 거라 어때요 그래서라 녀알렘베 풍부 녀알렘베 풍부 요라 녀알렘바부 다 매바 미롱셔라 녀알렘베 풍부레테네 나도 다바 임베 녀알렘베 풍부레테네 다스타 요라 풍부레테네 다도 다바 임베 다 매바 이나 풍부레테네 다바 다 매나네 풍부레테네 다바 셔디용 마라 녀알렘바 그다 미로에 셔테세 페나 매바 모샴지 푸 풍부레테네 다바 미로세 매바 모샴비 푸스테 요 마르테 풍부레테네 다바 헤신 디그마르와 다 매나 다 풍부레테네 다바 인 다 롱체바보 인세 풍부레테네 원봉아체 텔레테네 수다투르자 롱체바보 인세 디용마라 아니 데부 뇽시 나미 데부 뇽 기베 데부 뇽시 뇽게 용마라 다 요레스 예나야 테네 타바삼 텐지 데버리 좋아 참게 다 요레스도 어디버티 치주나
So then we turn to this section, the self that does exist. So the question arises, the appropriated aggregates are not the self, and the self is not some other entity or substance distinct from the aggregates. So does this mean that does this mean then the self does not exist? So having refuted some kind of objectively existent self, something that is aside, apart from the aggregates, someone might have the question, well, then is this self totally non-existent? Well, in response to that, it makes no sense to say the appropriated aggregates exist, but the self that is the appropriator does not. So here, if it is the case that we are asserting that the self is something that is designated upon the aggregates, if the aggregates exist, but the self that is the appropriator does not, that doesn't make any kind of sense. And so too, if it is the then if there is no designated self, then we would have no functioning either. So as the self is imputed in dependence upon the appropriated aggregates, if the self were completely non-existent, it would make no sense to impute a self in dependence upon the aggregates. Like you can't impute the non-existent son of a barren woman in dependence on the aggregates. So here, when we talk about there being a self that is dependent, that is imputed or designated independence on the aggregates, it wouldn't make sense for that to be something that is completely non-existent or non-functioning. If there is something like, if the self were not completely non-existent, then it wouldn't make any kind of sense to designate that on independence upon the aggregates. If it's just an utter non-existent phenomena.
Oh yeah. 다 담아대 셰차에 디 쿵디 장디와라. 이건 나와 잡아게. 젠더게 들어. 그러면 나와 잡아 디 쿵장게 직세로 엄마 직세로. 사실 저 직세 농장게 왔다. 대다른 로변 나와 잡아 엄마 직세래. 대다 임바스 디 로변 나와 잡아 직세나 송샤스오래. 근데에서는 지대 녀와 랑바당 지대 녀와 랑바당 녀와 렘바부 직도 타완 교회 칠당 하세. 와 종아다 지바니도 타완 교회 칠. 다 녀와 렘베 풍부랑 신자야 마이나 하세. 딸셰처럼 봐. 다디 풍부 다랑시 직 말에 시거라. 그래서나 뒤에나 뭐다 지대 녀와 렘바부 직도 타완 교회 칠. 녀와 랑자다 녀와 렘바부 직 차도로. 녀와 렘바부 다르바 녀와 랑자 풍부가로. 미 껴와랑시 단대 껴와랑시 때다때 풍풍 때 랑고야라 때 지지그래로래 텐데 말해서라 지도 타완 교회 치다 종아다 지관이도 타완 교회 치시 종아다 지관이도 타완 교회 치시 녀알렘베랑 신체 마일라스 나 매바 풍비 교응안에 매바 교응하마 매바 사바 종고다 소보도 사바 종고다 네 종아다 지관 때 지소나 네 겨치마데 균데 겨치마게 드라요 마라 소부데 레데라 루도라 디 균드라요 마라 미네 지방에도 교화를 치르 다 녀알렘베랑 신자야 마이세 다데 풍비랑 신직 말에세 딘데서 데 녀알렘베 풍불라 떠바라 타데바 손도 예베세레 녀알렘베랑 신자야 마이라 데 녀와 렘발라 마데바라 타데바 손도여바 타완 교회시 어디 타데도 여나야 녀랭이 풍부송알라 마데바 코카가 데레 승근지치에 요구레 팀벤도스 단달레도서 네 교회체를 정하지 주도하다 교회체 셴야만 있어 풍부래 셴도 요 말에 아니 녀알렘발라 마데바 손도 셴도 여나 녀알렘바 송알라 마데바 공근지치에 요구레 풍부가부 강루마 손이 코라 태가 카둘라 아니 응지치에 요티 요 말에서 와라 여바 타완 교회체를 녀알렘바 매바야 많이 넣어세 대단한 하나 다 매도 시차와 다 매서는 야도 와세래 대단한 다 매도 시차 시차와라고 선때 야도 와시거라 대 말에서 단데 엄마 치세 롱코라다 저바 매반이도 대망에서 대자와시를 불러라 다 매버려서 다 매반이도 게 말에서 다 요래서 거라 매반이도 대망에 가시 풍불라 때네 딱과 매도 풍불라 때네 딱과 삼게 다 매도 슬람네 dig 말에서 매도 시차와 지다른 곳에 여바 마이베 모샴지 부비 여바 마이나네 모샴부나 시레 모샴부데 풍불라 때네 따세야 매도 디나시 다데 풍불라 때네 다 딱바세 매버레도 그래서라 밑에버레도 그래서라 여바 마이베 모샴지 부네 풍부다라 때네 도바 마이노 녀알렘바 대신도 녀알렘바 보 매도시나 녀알렘바 여신도 녀알렘바 보 매도 시차와 지다 릭발 주데 대셔레 때네 매반이도 아메리도서 다 매반 그 말했을 때 풍불을 때네 딱 받침도 요래서라 이 자식으로 다도도 매반이도 대망해시 대셔레 다 매도 냐배 녀반데야 밑에도 오세 어디 봐도 지교나
So then, based upon the kind of reasoning that was explained above, the sort of signs that were laid out, there's then a source for this from the Clear Words commentary on the fundamental verses of the Middle Way by the Master Chandrakirti, in which he states then, the self is not the same nature as the appropriated, because this would entail that the appropriated and the appropriator would be the same, and also that the self would arise and perish like the aggregate. So again, it can't be the case that the self is one and the same as the aggregates that it appropriates, because then it would arise and perish with those aggregates. With each time that we, for example, take up a new form, you would then have a new self. And so thereby, the self and the aggregates, the appropriator and the appropriated, cannot be one and the same. But it's also not the case that the self, as it continues from this Clear Words commentary, the self is not separate from the appropriated aggregates, because this would mean that the self could be identified separately without depending upon the appropriated aggregates. So also the self is not apprehended without apprehending the appropriated, because this would entail identifying a self that does not depend on the appropriated aggregates. So if it were the case, again, if the self could be apprehended in the absence of those appropriated aggregates, we can just sort of directly point to it and identify, yes, this is the self, then it would have a kind of existence that is independent of those aggregates, of the appropriated aggregates. But it's not something that we can apprehend without apprehending that appropriated base. We can't have a sense of an I without the appropriated aggregates. And so thereby, the self that is not that is somehow separate, again, and apart, distinct from the aggregates, is not something that can logically be asserted. And then, so you might think, well, if that is so, then don't you have to say that the self does not exist? Okay, so the self is not the same as the appropriated aggregates, nor is it something that is totally different and separate from those. So this person thinks, well, then don't you have to say that the self does not exist? Well, in one way, yes, the self as it appears to us normally doesn't exist. However, it is also not the case that the self does not exist, as in being something that is entirely non-existent. For how can you say that that which is imputed in dependence on the aggregates does not exist? How can you say that, like the son of a barren woman, something completely non-existent is not imputed in dependence upon the aggregates? So here, how would it be possible to say that the appropriator does not exist while the appropriated does exist? Thus, the non-existence of the self is also not tenable, and it is also not correct to say that the self does not exist. So it is suitable for us to assert that there is some kind of a self. It isn't something that exists in the way of being exactly the same with the appropriated or separate from the appropriated aggregates, but yet it is tenable to assert the existence of a self, and to say that it is utterly non-existent is not suitable.
Oh yeah. But the number Shabanes, Lobby Sanja, because daughter was on the other. Because Tadi, then Pumbola, then a talk was some detention to a target Namshadi, gave her a woman Jubale share till then, Shembachi Sungora, Tadi number Shabane, gave her a woman Jubale, neighbor Shawose. And did he answer Uma Chuse Kapkala share, yes, Diane Gashig Mansore. Did he Kapkasu number Shabache, Simbisher, and did it number Shaba. Mechao Sheson so Tibet.
Um, So here then closing up this quotation from the clear words, he says the description of this self can be ascertained in detail in my entering the middle way, because I have already described it at several points here in this work. I will not present it again here. So this is something that is explained both in Chandrakirti's entry to the middle way as well as other points throughout clear words. So he then isn't going to describe it in detail again at this point.
인지 땅산, 조소에, 단대 차선, 안되셔. 어딘데 사세. 걔나 풍부 다 마이라, 다들 돈다 따마셔, 돈다 두두지 셔기도. 다 직세 롱 조소. 걔나 풍부 다 마이라, 된데서 풍부를 제시한바 뭐 생기 다자 메라 된데서 풍부 다 말에 풍부를 뭐 터대베 다요 말에서. 다나 가르세 때네 딱바 점라 다 적바 임베서 풍부라 때네 풍부가라 때네 봐 딱바 점지 당에 딱바 점지 다 샤고 그래서 때네 딱바 점지 다 땡진데 버는 중에 다 샤고 그래서 임베 풍부다 오직바 풍부다 오직바 풍부 다 말인데 풍부다 오직바 서고라 풍부를 로스요 말에 다 다가 샤고서 풍부다 오직바래 독바 직바 말에 요 오직바세 다 저거인데 풍부다 오직바다 유라제 딱배 다요 말다 유라제기 다요래 참에 직부 다요 말다 차다 제배 다요래 요 차다 제보다 풍부라 되배 풍부라 되면 그배 랑어도 주배 다요 말데 풍부 시야라 되바 전기 다요래 소라 풍부라 되배 시야와 전기 다네 요반이도 어디 보도 지주네.
So then, having concluded the quotation from the Clear Words commentary, it says then, therefore, the self is not completely the same as the aggregates, nor is the self a totally different entity or substance from the aggregates. So here, it isn't the case that the self is exactly the same as the aggregates, nor is it a totally separate and a different entity or substance from the aggregates. However, we can posit a self that is a mere imputation in dependence upon the aggregates. So in terms of the self that does exist, we can assert a self that is a mere imputation in dependence on the aggregates. And it is then feasible that there is a self that changes and is one nature with the aggregates. Now, here, when we say that the self is something which is merely designated in dependence upon the aggregates. Using various conventions, using terms, we can designate a self upon the aggregates. And here, where it says that it is something that changes and is of one nature with the aggregates, for something to be of the same nature is not as the same as being, it is just the same. So the aggregates and the self are not one and the same, but they have the same nature. So they're of one nature, but they're not of the same isolate or conceptual isolate, as in we can have them arise to our mind separately. So here, where it says that there is a self that is one nature with the aggregates, we should understand that that is not the same as being one and the same, and that it is something that has parts and is other powered in being dependent on the aggregates. So this self that we can identify as existing is something that is of the same nature as the aggregates, has various parts, is made up of parts, and is other powered in the sense that it is dependent upon the aggregates.
Oh yeah. that's what they get some butwa. Things kashe wati nangbe takeling mare take melena. Nikewachima use karsigre se to take melima marwa takbata. Doji Raj and the Pumbulation Betake Melim Take Lengiora. This service is Chavura. What in this and Mambuora? Oh, teacher. Penny? Oh, yeah, teacher. Quando Tixele son batarcera. Uma Tixecus and daughter were son soa. Uma Juguele Sheba Chise. Son soata. Uma Juguecus ta. Then a talk with some leta, you don't condition in the Tishiora. When I quando Tixele son batar. Umalan Jubara, Tag and Namsha, Chidar Song Yachina, Uma Juba Kaps Tag and Namsha Condition Yoresena, and they did song Yores Chitangiora. The order of Uma Juba Debalese, Juba Randre Derwa, Juba Randre Lese, Tag and Namsha, Sunjuni Tingi Lese, Juba Randre Naltro. Dole Jan, Doi Long Chitayore, Doi Long Chatan, Talang at Lapsara. Dole Jan, Taji Chawa, Tuji Sim, Kene Tower and Joai, Duji Pumbun Detonde, Della Simjan Yomai, Chidrayala, Sonamla, Tennis in the Chuba Taris. No, Tennis in the Chubata. Tishi Pumbun Nam Tene, Kunzu Simja Shake Dosora. Tishi Pumbun Nam Tene, Kunzu Tanyedo, and Damba to a man, Kunzu to Simjan Shake or your race, she song shows and Doi Long Tara. Sheben Dodi is a Dodi. Pumbula Rama Saigi, Ta maybe as a Pumbula Rama to Tubatan, Saigi Tayo Mares or Ranka to be Sayesera. The Darieba Tawa Mirun says, Tajo Tujis and Kuni Tawa and Yuat and Badasum Gavara, and Duji Pumbu Diton to dinner Rama to Tubetata, Ta Umabachine Rama to Tuba Rangini to Chasura, Shandane Ranka to be Sayiki Ta Mese, Sagura. Shesoje, Ta maybe, the Darieba Tawa Mirun says, Tedanaya Chidari Inaya. Say Gitada, Taji Raja Tada, Rangani Tibeta, Menaya, and they are that I heard Dasangora. Tedanaya, Chitari Shingde Yala, Rerewata, Sokba Kaya, Shinda Maishins, Tatala, the Chamba Namruta Drechan. Tedale Shembe, Shindaya Yomare, Namru Yomare, Yala Rele Shembe. Tedanaya Shinde Yala, Sokba Latene, De Shinda, Takwa Samla, Shinda Jogwatas. Shinde Yala Chokba, Namdu Chashakanga Chokba, Lega Chingatela Tene, de Tires Pata Patsame, Shigda Shagodo, Tinashita de Pumbula Tene, Tapatsame Shagodo, so Pumbunamle, Kaya, Taiba, Tamahila, Pumbunana Kaya Tamare, Pumbuteta Lango, Shembete, Yomare, Tayomare, Yaba Mahila, Maya. Pungu namla tene takwa samje ta jo gobar sungde se pungu la tene takwa samje cho tene ta se de tenchen de bar jo ase de ni ora kudan ken la tenchen de ne jo a chi se ra da shi am cha she chi bare de la tene te dan de ne ene lo yo to ta se jo e chi do tene takwe ta tene takwe tende tene jo e tende sini she do de tene takwe tende she ora Sopala tene de shinda she takwa chan le shinda cheba da pungu namle kaya ta maya la teta le ngo shendo ya ta yeba maya ya pungu namle tene takwa chan je ta jo go bar sunde uma juba le ese teta tembe puta go she se or te bar che chuna le bisu ya
Mm, mm. So here then the question arises, well, how is the self presented in Chandrakirti's entering the middle way, as his clear words mentions? So here again, the whole context for this is that there are those schools that would say, well, if Buddhists assert selflessness, then why is it that they even talk about future lives? How is it that this self actually exists? If they are asserting that selflessness is just the total absence of a self, then it wouldn't make any sense to talk about past and future lives and our concern with liberation and so forth. But yet this is something that is explained in the Buddhist texts in a way that doesn't just completely negate the self, but we need to understand how it exists. So in the way that Chandrakirti presents the self in his entering the middle way is as follows. So he begins by quoting a sutra. So this is the auto commentary that he would have written to his entry to the middle way. And so again, so self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. These composite aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. Just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon collections of parts, so we use the convention living beings in dependence upon the aggregate. So here, conventionally speaking, we can talk about a self as existing, but it isn't something that exists as a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. So according to this sutra, as there is no self in the aggregates that exists substantially in the sense of being independent, it is unsuitable to believe such a self exists. Now, again, we have to understand that there are different levels of subtlety. Here, kind of a substantially existent self is something more coarse, but we can also sort of apply this to the more refined or more subtle level. And so for something to not be existent, like from its own side, have that kind of objective existence is a way to read that. If you take the example of a chariot, neither each part of the chariot nor the collection of parts is the chariot. And there is also no chariot that is some substance separate from those. So like the kind of reasonings that we've gone through above. Yet, nonetheless, in dependence upon the collection of chariot parts, we posit chariot as a mere imputation, saying this chariot. Likewise, while none of the aggregates are the self, and there is no self that is a substance or entity separate from these aggregates, the sutra states that we must posit a self by mere imputation in dependence upon the aggregates. So here we can use the example of like a chariot or update it and use something like a plane. But when we look for the thing as it appears to us, as existing in and of its own right, in and of itself, we can't actually find that. But yet we can speak of the self or the chariot or a plane as being something that is a mere imputation, a mere designation with terms and conventions in dependence upon a particular basis. So here, when we talk about the self as being something that is a dependent origination. Dependent origination we can understand on the level of things being produced from causes and conditions, but also in terms of dependent designation, that in the mind designates with terms and concepts on a particular basis. And that level of merely imputed or merely designated existence is the way in which the self exists.
뭐야? 다들 롱치장도 음악 주과래 해서 나와다 봐. 간질 때문에 공부 다 하고 시 송바 대체 공부 다 하든 어디 네트 대체 롱치 와라. 다 삼삼 삼을단도 가르치고 그래서는 다지 삼바데 녀알렘베 풍부가 보데다 고나라 따오세. 다 선생아서 따야 돼. 가를 따고 그래서는 녀알렘베 풍부데다 고나라 따오서래. 제가 가지서 녀알렘베 풍부가데 따르 와세. 상대 좀 된데 다시 냠도 따도 녀알렘베 풍부를 메네는 아 삼사 따고 손도 와세. 대공장 거라. 풍부 따임 버들. 어디 던다디 말에서 대시하거라. 간질 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바 대실 풍부 따도 나서 풍부 따래서 대공장 거라 건져. 지자마 다ተ서 공장 거라. 때문에 따고 냠도 따왔더니 녀알렘베 풍부데다 코나라 따오 손도 와서 거라. 녀알렘베 풍부도 따래도 와서 산제 손도 와서 거라. 어디 던데 말을 따서 대던다셔 간질 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바 대실 풍부 따는데나 근데 그 말에서 그래 지자마도 저래. 걔네 풍부래 생각봐대. 그 풍부래 된 생배 따요 말에서. 다 스도사 풍부 나올로 쇼된 게 이렇게 도와지 여대서 라화도 주바서. 근데 요 말을 다 하세. 풍부래 따고 풍부래 면에 아 섬게 와래서 그래. 풍부래 때네. 미사데라 또 가지고 다다도 nga sende soso sobore chime minene nga sambudo pro phege ta re sha sende phege phungbola tene ene pa mine ta tagdo phungbote ta re samge samge o mara o te tandar phungbola tan shambe ta yo mare phungbola mine ta do ta ge o tanda phungbola mine ta ge o re se ra ta samge o re se mata phungbo mai ge shanda chile mine ta se ta ge o mare sungora ti phungbo ta ye beto mare 풍부를 때네 다스파 삼피어레스 티톤다레스 간지 때문에 풍부 따고 시 송바대질 풍부 따되나 아니 대 말에 되네 풍래 현당 거 보데 풍불에 된 셈배 다요 말에 다 섬도 풍불에 면에 다요래 스다요래 송거래서 아 수다메서 가래스는 풍부 다에네 사게 좀 되게 수다메 좋아다메 두시다메 시든데 너만부나 송도와 그래서 다래로라 뒤메 송도와 어디 말해서라 셰다야 되니래 야 되니래 개념도 되šan데 치버려 대체 대야나 초남라 신다nhân 신다 다다 총세 다야 같이 직 되삼거라 신대야나 속바데 다래 삼거라 신다라 속바라 풍부가 속바데 풍부가 속바데 신대야나 속바데 다래스나 소라 풍부 속바 다임바 되바 대세스거라 대세스 풍부가 속바데 대다에서는 되마 대야라 초나는 신대nhân 풍부야라 속바 좀 다임바 되바 대세 그런 겨 가려운 거라서나 아니 신대야라 초좀 대 신대래로라서라 대세 대야라 초남라 신대nhân 신대야라 강거 루루스 비게 잘라 가져나 대주니 수숨지가 대루루서잖아 야라 초대어라 대신대래로라서라 속바점을 쓰게 말해서 속바점 다이나 풍부 속바점 다이나 신대야라 속바점 대 신대인구라 근데 신대가 잘라 가져나 대강가 대초샤나 대신대래로고 대신대래가 말아 자와 지금 말아 신대 자와 지금 말아 야라 초여대 그래서 대야라 초남라 신대인 줄 신대 당다서 아니 다대 풍부 속바점을 시작이네 신대들라 소본 것부터 이 자식한 거 초과점을 시작하고래서 걔네 신대야라 자식한 거 버져 루루제소요샤 뽕샤요나 대신대래도 그래서 신대니 주루세 그래서 신다다 다니보데 자식을 때는 따고 총발해서라 신다 땅다 총세 신다다 다니보데 자식을 때는 따고 총발해 왔어 어디보다 지켜나 근데
So then again, speaking about the way in which the self actually does exist. Now it says Chandrakirti's entering the middle way states, now you may claim that the teacher said the aggregates are the self, so you assert the aggregates to be the self. So here there are those who might have this kind of wrong idea that in certain places where the Buddha, the teacher, has said that the aggregates are the self, that means that the self actually is the aggregates. But really, this is asserting that the self is something which is only observable independent upon the aggregates. So this is really referring to or refuting the idea that the self could be something apart from, aside from the appropriated aggregates. So as it continues in this quotation from Entering the Middle Way, but the Buddha's statement refutes a self separate from the aggregates. In other sutras, he explained that form is not the self, and so forth. So here, where someone might want to assert that, well, but the Buddha has said that the aggregates are the self, this is not something that we can understand sort of literally, but rather that the Buddha is teaching that in order to refute the idea of a self that could be something apart from the aggregates. Now, there's another quotation here from Chandrakirti's Entry to the Middle Way, where he says that, were it not so, if we compare the chariot to the self, the mere collection of a chariot's parts would constitute a chariot. So again, for someone who wants to assert that, well, the Buddha has said that the self is just a collection of the aggregates. So really, it's that is what we can identify as the self. Well, when we look at this with the example of a chariot, if you have all of the various parts that constitute a chariot, but you just have them sort of like separate and then piled up, it's not as though we would say that that's a chariot. It can't function as a chariot. And so therefore, we can't say that just the mere collection itself is is that thing? And so all of the various parts, for example, that make up a self are not in and of themselves the self, but rather they are the basis of a designation. It is that on which we are able to designate the thing as existing, but it's not as though for example, with a chariot, that just the heaped up pile of parts we would assert to be a chariot. It can't function as a chariot, but rather it is only in dependence upon the particular basis that we can have something that is dependently designated. So the self, in turn, needs to observe the aggregates, which is why the teacher has said that the aggregates are the self, or all are the basis of observation when we designate the self. Yeah, so our time is up for today, so we will have to stop there.
Thank you again, Rinpoche, and thank you so much for the beautiful motivations and your very clear teachings on this precious text. And thank you, Katrina, for your very clear and articulate translation. So again, we won't be meeting until the end of September, and we wish Geshe very safe travels and beneficial travels, and we will see you in September. So we'll finish with we'll finish with some dedication prayers now. May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Losang's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Dhyatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise